Hello, my friends. Welcome to a brand new episode of the Christ and Coffee podcast, bringing the church together one coffee hour conversation at a time. Today, we're going to talk about the Christian dating scene with the date doctor herself, Dr. Christie Kederian, joining the program. How are you doing?
Good. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited that you're here to share your expertise on this wonderful topic and just share your data and your experience just counseling so many people to find the love of their life. With the nuance of a Christian trying to find another Christian to find the love of their life. Mm-hmm. So what has it been like, the current state of the Christian dating scene?
So obviously after the pandemic, we saw a lot of shifts in how modern dating was happening, specifically within the Christian community. I think a big piece of what a lot of Christians struggle with is finding someone where there's similar values, as well as they feel like they match them in other ways, their personality type, they're attracted to them, all of those things. And I think within the church, there's not too many opportunities and not too many spaces where being single is really kind of celebrated. It's seen more as like a waiting period for a lot of people. Right. It's not really talked about too much or taught on too much besides, don't do this and don't do that. So how I really see it is we're trying to navigate modern dating with traditional values as believers. And we have to really have that overall concept of being in the world, but not operating as it does, but still being open to using the tools like online dating and just how to get to know people without just saying, okay, I'm just going to wait at home and hope my soulmate comes with the next Prime delivery, So that I think is a really big problem, I would say, that's facing a lot of Christians as they're going about the dating process.
Right. And I think you mentioned an important thing about the checkbox of the Christian label. That's a hard one to find, and that narrows the dating pool significantly these days, especially when you're looking for like a practicing Christian versus the cultural label of a Christian. And then I feel like some Christians have to date to see how committed are they in their faith, first of all.
Yeah.
And then everything else that everyone struggles with, finding the compatibility, the attraction, the passions, and just getting along as friends. So there's these multi-layers of these traditional values in a post-secular world. Mm-hmm. And it's just interesting landmine. And I feel for a lot of people because I know quite a bit of Christians who are still single, still looking, and they seem very frustrated, I think is the word.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what is one of the challenges that I work with a lot of clients on is figuring out, okay, what parts of being a Christian are really important to you. So sometimes we're getting a little bit granular, like, okay, they have to be a Christian and have the same political views as me, right, and the same, denomination or the same, flavor, and they have to worship like this and not like this, right, and come into my church and naturally fit in, or whatever those kind of ands are. And I think what we don't realize is that's not really what we're called to as believers in general, around unity and kind of right, overlooking certain things and saying, okay, what is best for just the church in general? And then specifically, like, what is God really calling you to as far as how your relationship looks? Is this really so that you're happy? And, there's a lot of literature on this, but, like Tim Keller talks a lot in his book about, okay, like what is the meaning of marriage? Is this for your satisfaction, so all your needs are met and you just find someone that you ask, what can they do for me? Or is it we're both on this journey together to do God's work, and this is a partner that we're not facing each other and expecting that from each other, but more like we're going in the same direction towards whatever God's calling us to. So I think having that perspective really flips how you go about the dating process, because you're not just looking for reasons that someone's not a fit for you.
Yeah.
You're rather saying, okay, they have the same values as me, they have that personal relationship, and there's some other things that I can kind of work with and work through.
Yeah. No, I definitely noticed that the political stuff and the denominational stuff could be that final straw. And I'm like, this could be a little picky at this point.
Yeah, exactly.
But it does matter, because I think we're both Armenians, so we have that common story we hear or experience ourselves, where like one parent is Protestant, one parent is Orthodox, and the same team, but that creates tensions as well.
Exactly.
So, and then the political part too, especially in this climate where everything is super political, it doesn't help, because they're becoming like religions at this point too in many ways.
Exactly.
But you mentioned Tim Keller, and I remember him telling me once there's this tendency in the church to idolize marriage, but there's this tendency in the secular culture to demonize it, like it's an outdated practice.
Yeah.
And and this is the tension we're kind of talking about. There's this one aspect where the secular world is like, no, let's just hook up, let's cohabitate, let's even have kids before we're married, being like a new norm. And then on the church side, no, if you're not married by 25, you're not a Christian anymore.
Yeah.
like there's these,
excommunicated.
yeah, exactly. So there's that tension, right? Like from both strings. And I think if we properly understand the Christian gospel, it says marriage is a reflection of the gospel ultimately. But if you're single, like Jesus, like Paul, like Lydia, you're okay too. And that was revolutionary.
Yeah.
And we don't quite create that space sometimes in certain church cultures that it's okay to be single. And in fact, you can't be happy married unless you're happy single, as cliche as that is. It's gospel.
Yeah.
But sometimes the church could fuel the idolization narrative but by reacting to the secular narrative, and that doesn't help either.
Totally.
And it leads to a lot of weird Christian dating scenes.
Yeah. And I think one thing to speak to that is that a message that I hear a lot from Christian women that are single is like, okay, is God calling me to singleness just because I haven't found the right person? Or sometimes I haven't even dated or put myself out there, or I think online dating, for example, is just taking things into my own hands and not trusting God, whatever that really means for that person. And so I think that almost kind of hinders people because they think, okay, maybe God just wants me to be single. But really what they need to do is look underneath the surface and say, what are some things that are really blocking me from putting myself out there or dating or pursuing, this thing that I feel like God has put a desire in my heart to have marriage or to find that right person to get married to. So I think sometimes we kind of use that as like an excuse of like, oh, okay, I'm just waiting on God's timing, but then we're not really healing some of those patterns that need to be healed. We're not doing our part. We're not acting. That whole faith and works conversation, I think works beyond salvation. It's like in anything you're asking God, okay, I want this thing. And then you also have to kind of do your part in being prepared for that thing, or kind of how can I partner with God in what he's calling me to? So I think that gets a little bit tricky too, because people somehow think that if they go on a dating app or start dating or whatever, then they're somehow taking that into their own hands, or they're idolizing it too much. And so I think it leaves a lot of people with questions of like, okay, I guess I'm just meant to be single. They kind of throw their hands up. And
then you ask them, how many dates you been on?
Yeah, it's like zero.
It's like, well, what do you expect?
Yeah. So I think that we have to be really careful with that conversation too, because, some people do really feel that calling, and some people feel that over time to be single, but you just want to make sure you've done all your work. So you're not kind of keeping yourself from a blessing that God has for you, but you haven't really done your part in it.
I love the story of, is it Isaac and Rebecca?
Yeah.
Like there was really a matchmaker.
Exactly.
Abraham sent.
I'm like, that's the first matchmaker. It's in the Bible.
And there was work.
Yeah.
He was having difficulty. He wanted to marry someone from his cultural background, religious beliefs. It took a while, and he observed someone with good character, which is also important.
Totally.
And I love that story, as weird as it is with the camels and the watering of but it shows you that there's effort that needs to be put if you desire this, because guess what? If you're married, you're going to even put more effort.
Yeah.
And if you don't work on yourself while you're single, you're going to have to work extra hard while you're trying to deal with someone else's baggage and your own baggage. So it's better to just be discipled well. And I think that's a part of the problem in Christian circles. If we disciple well, it'll lead to naturally healthy marriages. But if we don't disciple, it'll just be very worldly, and then there'll be nothing special about the relationship.
Yeah, exactly. And I think sometimes people feel like, okay, if I, give my list to God, then it'll all work itself out. An angel is going to drop someone in front of your door. Yeah, and then I don't have to make that space in my life. When people tell me, oh, I'm too busy today, I'm like, then you're definitely too busy for a relationship, because if you're not creating that time right now to have space and margin, then how are you supposed to allow God to work and have that in your life too?
Yeah, and then the other thing too, maybe the person's already right in front of you, but you've already blocked them out You friend zone them.
Yeah.
You just be like, oh no, he's a brother in the Christ, not a suitable spouse. Even though we serve together, we go to we live in the same community. We both love God and we get along and we actually have a good time together.
Yeah.
But no, we can't cross that romantic boundary. God forbid if that happens.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times we've had clients like go through our whole program, work with us, and then they're like, oh, the person was right in front of me all along, when I really got clear with my work and what was blocking me from being open to that.
So do you feel like a lot of your work is actually discipling people versus trying to find the one?
Yeah, I think it's like a combination. A lot of it is, it's kind of that balance is what I say is between the soul work and the strategy. Like you really need both pieces. Like if you're doing all the things going on, 10 dates a week and like using, saying, okay, I'm doing my part, but then you're not really kind of doing that inner work. Like you said, learning to be satisfied with yourself, working through, your like past patterns, difficult stuff in your family dynamics, whatever it is, then you're not really, you might find someone, but they might not really be that compatible or not a healthy relationship. But if you're doing like, all the therapy and going to church and Bible study and whatever, and then you don't do anything in the dating world and just kind of hope it happens magically, then that's kind of like only half the story. So we really kind of do both.
Strategy as in put in the effort, go on the dates.
Yeah, the right strategy.
And then the soul work as in get your stuff in order, know what you really want, what are it's like a good essentials list.
Exactly. Like, and know why you want it. Like a lot of times when we do that inner work, it's like, okay, I think this is important to me, but actually when I process it, like my family, this is why we had a client, for example, that her parents really, the only reason they were together was because of tradition, same cultural background, whatever. So she kind of swung the other way. And so all she was dating, the only type of person she was dating are people that she was really attracted to, but there was no deeper substance because she felt like, well, they didn't have any chemistry. And so I don't want to do that. When actually what she wanted was someone kind of in the middle, like there's chemistry, but there also shared values and tradition. And so when she had that realization, she was able to attract like a healthy partner instead of just looking for only chemistry because she thought that was the missing piece, but that's not the whole thing.
Right. So yeah, I think that's important because we tend to, if we have positive role models in our parenting, then it's easier to, I think, pick better spouses most of the time, unless you do the soul search. But I see that happen a lot. Like my parents had an awful divorce. I don't know if marriage is for me, or they were like this robotic arranged marriages. And I don't know if I don't want that. Like you said, this client wants the complete opposite, but I think the goal is health regardless of what kind of dynamic, because every couple has baggage. It's just making sure we are aware of it and what really is the essentials. And I think when I try to help people with the dating scene, it's trying to listen to the music behind the words and okay, what does that mean by wanting a Christian? Is it just a cultural stamp? Is it someone I want to do ministry with? Because there's all these different things to that label, as you mentioned earlier, that I think is important to unpack. And I think if it's a really serious Christian commitment where you want to do ministry and all that, you give advice differently than someone who's like a nominal Christian, right?
Yeah.
I've learned that lesson the hard way.
Yeah, exactly. And the best analogy that I've heard comes from Dr. Dale Clark Warren. He's the founder of eHarmony. And and I used to work there, I did some kind of research around compatibility. And he would always say, the more similar you are in really important ways, that actually the more compatible you are. So we hear, in culture, like opposites attract a lot of times. But I think as Christians dating in a new way, we have to think about what are the values that need to be similar and what aren't. And so the analogy he uses is the grocery store of dating. So let's pretend we're in a grocery store. We have to find our partner, but everybody only has $100 to spend. So if you want a trait in someone that's less commonly occurring in society, so let's say it's like cultural background or Christian, that's a more expensive trait. So, you're getting the organic produce here. Yeah. You're using more of your $100 allowance. So if you want someone who's a really devout Christian, that's, let's say, $70. So if you also want them to be within 5 miles of you and 6'4" and went to Harvard and whatever, like you don't don't have enough money for that. So you have to really prioritize and kind of budget when it comes to that and say, you know what, this thing's really important to me, being Christian or Armenian. So then I'm willing to be flexible on like some other things, like their height or
especially with
where
the
they
Armenians.
live. Yeah, exactly. That's even more
and
expensive.
the hairiness factor. You gotta, you gotta sacrifice on those. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's really what I like to share with people. It's like, it's not that you have to settle or, force yourself to be with someone you don't like. It's more about kind of reprioritizing. Okay, these things are most important to me, so I'm willing to be flexible around other things.
Do you feel like a lot of the clients or people out there tend to have too high standards or too low standards, or it depends on the person?
Yeah, it definitely depends on the person. The way that I'm really trained in what I talk about is attachment theory. So generally, if someone's a little bit more anxiously attached, they really desire this like connection no matter what. So they tend to kind of lower their standards a little bit. They're like, oh, it's fine. He's been married 5 times and not fully divorced or whatever. They're kind of like, because they desire the connection so much, they're willing to overlook a lot of potential red flags. But someone who's a little bit more avoidant will say, oh, their tooth looks a little weird in that picture, like left swipe, not a good fit. They're looking for red flags everywhere. And so that tends to be a person who really values their independence and autonomy and the connection not so much. They want to protect themselves almost. So that person tends to be a little bit too picky.
Fascinating. No, because that describes it. And I never seen the connection with the attachment theories. So then the extreme avoid, what's the worst one of the 4 of the attachment theories?
The disorganized.
What is there the behavior?
So you're kind of swinging through both things. It's phases. Not too predictable. Yeah. And a lot of attachment theory starts in like childhood, essentially with your caregiver. And so you're kind of seeing that pattern play out differently in different people.
So you experience both depending on their wounds, like if they're too picky. And again, I've seen like, oh, the person's outfit is not cool enough for the date. And I'm like, that's the one thing you could change.
Yeah, exactly.
And then the other is like, this person is a serial killer. You still want to date her? Like, okay. So, I've seen both, and that makes a lot of sense. So let's talk more about this dating scene for Christianity. There's stuff like Kissing Dating Goodbye. I think that did a lot of damage. Can you explain what that book was? And
So that
I remember thinking it was weird that everyone was listening to this like 18-year-old super traditional values. I think he's an atheist now.
Yeah, he had a whole like transformation, but it was he basically wrote this book that was like, dating isn't for Christians. Like we should just kind of do like what now we see in churches, like let's just observe each other from far, become friends for years and
secretly court.
Secretly court, or maybe not even. And then, then that person just ends up marrying somebody else and you're out of luck. But it's kind of what's happened from that is like, what I think the negative repercussions is that Christians now associate dating with like, this isn't really a faith practice. I'm going to kind of put this under the rug. And then also if you're going from the cultural component, Armenians will definitely be like, oh, like, when we have Armenian clients work with us, they're like, use a dating app? Like what? My dad will like kill me or something like that. Yeah. So that kind of feeling, I think, came from the idea that, okay, well, you're just going to meet the person. You should court each other and then just get married. And I do think, I don't know that there's actual statistics, but we see a really high divorce rate in the Christian community at really early ages because they kind of feel like, okay, well, I'm not going to date around. I'm just going to meet someone and know and get married. And then what happens is you pick someone that's not really a good fit for you. It doesn't work out.
So there's couple of people at fault with that because I do think dating is a self-discovery process, and if you date wisely and securely, you figure out what are essentials, non-essentials, and you redefine that list. And then but you're saying in the Christian world there's this unnecessary pressure that if you date, that's the one. And that's just stupid,
especially in the church. It's like you mentioned, this friend, if I cross that line, then I can't date anybody else, or it's going to be weird or whatever.
So what's a way to kind of make dating okay in the church setting then?
I mean, it's the $1 million question, right? I think the more that we're able to like normalize having some of those conversations, like, hey, I'm expressing that you're interested in somebody, maybe because you know them already. You don't actually have to date to know like, okay, they are a fit or not. But personally, what I recommend is using the tool of online dating. If you feel like, okay, I don't want to cross that, or there's nobody that I think that could be a good fit for me, because it helps you connect with other people that are from other churches or communities that might be more compatible. But I think the more that we normalize kind of expressing interest and earlier on in friendships or relationships, I've had clients in certain churches that's totally fine and comfortable. But I think when you add aspects to that make dating more worldly, so if you're kind of having like physical connections or intimacy with people, then that's where I think it
gets messy.
Problem. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you date with the intentionality of calling it a date, but not like doing it secretly or doing it worldly, then it could help cultivate. All right, we went on a few dates, but that's it.
Exactly.
Don't make a big deal out of it. We weren't in a relationship. They were just dates.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's dating with intention without the pressure of like courting for marriage and without the worldly aspect of like, oh, dating means we're hooking up.
Yeah. And the church culture itself needs to be like, all right, that's cute. They went on a few dates. Let's not plan their wedding and make a big ordeal about it. Let them figure out if they're compatible or not. And I think that space needs to be created, because it'll either be secretive and weird because they won't have that process of knowing if it's a good fit, self-discovery, or they'll do it in a way that they're going to just react to the church culture and just become the opposite and kind of let go of the Christian principles. What are some other trends you see that are maybe like not healthy for the dating scene in the Christian culture?
Yeah, I think that one is a huge one, probably one of the biggest ones. The other piece I would say is similar to what you said, but I think coming more from like a male perspective is like not being really clear and like forward with their intentions. And I think what you just described kind of plays into that a little bit, because they're so afraid of like doing the wrong thing. So then it creates a lot of confusion and mixed messages. Like, we've had so many women come to the program that, want to date. And then when we kind of dig deeper, oh, well, there is this guy at church. I've liked him for 10 years. And he's, I don't know that he's dated somebody in the meantime. He's probably dating a lot of people in the background, but they kind of think that that's like normal because no one's actually like explicitly expressing.
So what are your thoughts on if a girl likes a guy at church, is it okay for her to ask the guy out?
Yeah. So what I would say is what you would want to do is just like express, but not expect. So when we talk a little bit more about like leaning into like, the feminine, it's not like, hey, having that define the relationship, like, hey, what are we? Or like, hey, like, let's go out on a date. It's more like, hey, like, I really enjoy our time together and hanging out, and just like letting that be there. And then if they want to pursue you from that point, like, you've kind of, quote unquote, drop the hanky and they can pick it up. And
so drop more obvious hints if they're not getting the message.
Yeah.
And then, let's talk about it. Let's open the can of worms, because I think this is where the Christian church gets like poo-pooed upon with the gender roles and the headship of the house and of the male and the submissiveness of the wife. What is your aspect? What are your thoughts on just gender roles, and then comparing in the church and in general?
Yeah. So I think what, the big thing that I really see, especially from working primarily with women, is that and I work with like really successful, driven women, that their like ambition and I'll say like more masculine, quote unquote, qualities are really like, that's where they get their success from in the world, in corporate, wherever they work. And then the big struggle that they have is like, okay, I'm like this at work. I'm, going after it. I'm climbing the ladder. I'm being active and proactive. And then when it comes to like dating and relationships, they're kind of getting a different message there. And they don't know how to translate that. Like, how am I want this thing. I have this goal. I want to be married, whatever. And I don't really know how to go into that. But what I always kind of help people and empower them to do is like lean into that, like, if you're a woman, like lean into that femininity with the acknowledgement that like you have both parts in you. Like, and you talk about this with God, like all the time. He has aspects and personality traits that we would ascribe to like one gender or another. But especially when you're dating, I think you really have to kind of go about it in a way like the famous passage says. It's like, okay, husbands love their wives as Christ loved the church, and then the wife's submission comes as a result of that. So if you're a woman dating, you have to say, okay, is this someone that I can see loving me in that way and leading the family in that way.
Yeah.
So looking for those characteristics ahead of time instead of taking someone that doesn't have that leadership and doesn't have that, okay, we can kind of come together and make this like a good relationship. Then you're trying to force them to lead when you already naturally like want to run the show. That's not a good dynamic that works. So what I say is try to find someone that already embodies a healthy way of being in that way. And then you're going to naturally want to kind of have them lead the relationship more.
Yeah. And I think I remember like 20 years ago when I was an undergrad, I took a sociology class on the family, and the professor just dissected the Ephesians 5 passage and it was kind of like just attacking it nonstop. And I remember I also sensed a lot of hurt and found out later there was a lot of hurt behind that, because you usually get to that phase when there's a lot of abuse of those passages because of it says submit to one another, wives submit to your husbands. So the idea of submission is Christ-like because Christ submitted perfectly to the Father. And then the husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. So you also have to be Christ-like and the willingness to die for your spouse. That's what leadership means. I'm gonna take the bullet. So both are Christian expressions of Christ, and Paul says this is actually a mystery of the gospel. It proclaims what Jesus has done for his bride, the church, which is us. So it's interesting how much abuse could happen, but when it's done well, it's quite a beautiful thing. And I remember I preached on this actually a couple of weeks ago because we were going through Ephesians. Someone came up new to the church. I'm like, great, new person from Europe comes up to me and goes, I don't like this concept of men being the head of the house. And then I just use the analogy of a dance. It's kind of like a dance. Most cultures, the man is leading, but nudging, but they're usually one unit. The two are one. It's a beautiful dance. It just nudges, but they're in sync to the same rhythm. They're relying on the same sort of style or beliefs. And then they're doing this wonderful thing where they're dancing. Yeah. And then I asked her, how did you meet your spouse? And she goes, salsa dancing. I'm like, perfect. It worked. But I know a lot of people react when they hear that. And especially like my big fat Greek wedding joke, if the man is the head, the woman is the neck, and good take them wherever you go. But there is this, I think there's this longing for a lot of women for the guy to step up and lead. But then you're talking about, we're in a culture where there's more women in church, more women in school, more women in the workplace like there hasn't ever been. So there is this kind of unbalance, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like that's why a lot of women are frustrated.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's where kind of when you're going through the process of dating, looking for these characteristics, it bleeds into so many areas of your life and relationship and marriage, but really noticing like if you're choosing people that don't already exemplify the qualities you have, you are going to have, marriages or relationships where you have problems with passages like this, because you're like, how am I going to let this person lead, but they don't have those qualities in them.
I don't feel like this person's an equal. I don't respect this person. And I've seen that happen where the woman is in the same kind of field as the husband. She's more successful. And it kind of demoralizes the guy. Yeah. Yeah. There's aspects to this that we have to talk about.
For sure. And I think it's like a lot of times we're looking at like the content, like, okay, I make more money or, whatever. But really it's like that natural need. I think that women want someone that's going to be a provider, that's going to, be able to lead, that's going to take the initiative. But they don't have that trust either because of their past experiences, or even if they struggle with trusting God. I've seen that dynamic happen a lot too. So then they're constantly taking that role, even though they also want someone to, fill that role too. But providing is so different in different ways. Like, yeah, maybe one person makes more income, but what does that actually like mean? Like what's the meaning of money essentially? So there's a lot kind of embedded in that, but I think it comes a lot before marriage is what I'm trying to say, of like, you actually have to find someone who has qualities that you can say, hey, like we can be a team here and this is going to be my role. It's not less or it's not less important, or it's not weak.
Right. And I feel like women are superficial with height and income, right? On online dating, they have those filters, and men tend to be superficial on looks.
Yeah, exactly.
But to truly define what does it mean to be a provider, or it should be more like, all right, is this person trustworthy, and is he has a character to die for me? Like seeing that sort of protective characteristic versus this superficial. Oh, the guy's big, he could protect me, or the guy has a lot of money, he could provide for me.
Exactly.
So how do you help people break down their superficiality? And is it okay to have a little bit of that?
Yeah. I think it really comes down to like what the meaning of that is for you. And usually there's some wound around like that meaning.
Yeah.
So usually if like women are really successful, or, you know, like they have some feeling of like, okay, I'm not going to be provided for, so I have to take care of myself. So kind of getting to the wound will tell you why they want what they want. But what I really help people figure out is like, okay, if you have something on your criteria list, like what's the why? So for example, we had a client that was like, okay, I have to marry a doctor from my same cultural background. Okay, what's the why? Okay, well, you know, this whole story, her family, etc. Like this is the only type of income, you know, in my where she came from, these are the only type of people who had respect and whatever. When we really broke it down, it was like, okay, those are somebody else's why. It's not yours, so it's not feeling very aligned. You could find someone who's providing for you that isn't a doctor in this country. So there's kind of like, if you break that down, I think that's where your answer comes from. And then you always want to put it against like scripture, essentially. I do think chemistry and attraction is important when we look at like compatibility from a research standpoint. You know, eHarmony's research shows there's like 29 dimensions. And one of them is chemistry, but you know, there's 28 other dimensions. So yeah, it's important, but it's not everything. We need like the whole picture.
And that why is important. I think because when I do premarital counseling, the first question I ask is why you want to get married.
Yeah.
And then what is marriage? And then sometimes people can't answer it. They just talk about the attraction or the feelings in the moment, but not the big picture.
Totally.
And when you are falling in love or in love, it's hard. Like you're chemically unable to see. And I think that's why it's important to be a little like old school and get our families involved or friends that we could trust to kind of point out the blinders.
Yeah, it's true.
But yeah, so it's interesting that you're mentioning all this. And I think what you just said with the having the scriptures help explain the why, and that because if you're both Christians, then you have the same source of authority and you're relying on the same principles or standard, even if it's a high standard, at least we're in agreement. This is the standard we need to thrive towards. So how would you answer that question? Do I really need to marry a Christian if you're a Christ follower? How do you help people with that? Because I get that all the time now.
Yeah, I know. It's really common. What I always say is it's like if you're like, you know, going on a trip somewhere, and you are going on a train and in one direction, you might say, oh, you know, that car looks really cool, but it's a car, it's in a totally different vehicle, and it's going the complete opposite direction. That's what it's like if you marry someone who's not a believer. It's like they're not even going the same direction. They're not in the same type of vehicle, and you're supposed to try to like build a life or go to the same place, and that's not. And
it doesn't matter how great the vehicle is because
like, there's a Maserati, it's going to San Diego, and you're trying to go to Santa Barbara. It doesn't matter. So I think like that is really important to understand. Okay, if you don't want to marry, again, going back to the why, like if you're feeling like, I can't find anyone who's a Christian, for example, is something I get a lot. Okay, like what values are you putting in front of that? And if you are a Christian, then being, you know, that should be the central thing in your life. So there really shouldn't be anything more important than that. Obviously, you want some other things as well, but that's really the and. That's not like, oh, you know, and usually what happens from what I've seen is you meet someone, they're not a Christian, you build this really great emotional chemistry or whatever, and then it's hard to say, oh, no, this is not a fit. So from right off the bat, it's just a no.
So it's important to have a good filter so you don't go down that way. And and I think we do this with companies. You want the company to fail fast so you don't waste all this energy and effort into a failing business.
Exactly.
I think Elon Musk has a great quote. The worst thing an engineer could do is make something that shouldn't exist efficient.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then I think just taking on that principle of, all right, if this is a core essential, if it's 70% of my $70 of my $100 in the supermarket, is it really an essential or not? So yeah, that's important.
Yeah. And that's why when people kind of tell me, oh, online dating, I don't want to do that as a Christian, most times I will talk to them and they have fallen into that kind of relationship because they randomly met someone at a coffee shop through a friend, and then they kind of open themselves up to this because they haven't said, okay, I'm going to kind of get over my own stigma. I can put that Christian filter so no one's even coming across. Like I'm not even looking in the way of this isn't a right fit for me. So people for some reason are more open to not using that and just meeting people out there that don't share their values than they are to like using a tool that maybe has had stigma in the past, but I don't think now, they say it's the number one way to meet people post 2021. But and if you do that, like then you're not seeing people. Obviously you have to kind of explore like what does that mean if they put that they're a Christian, like is it really a Christian or just cultural or whatever. But at least you have that baseline.
So what I'm hearing is if you just find someone at a Starbucks or supermarket, there's this romantic aspect of it, but it's kind of not being intentional. You're just falling into the trap of love. But if you're like online, know what you're looking for, know who you are, that's intentional dating.
Yeah, exactly. And you might find, people out there in the world, but you have so much more work to do. Like, okay, are they Christian? Are they single?
They come from a good family, as the Armenians would say.
Do they want a relationship? Like, do they want marriage? Do they want kids? Where like the dating app could just do all of that work for you. And
so the dating app helps with like the first date, pretty much. It filters
exactly
stuff.
Yeah, like who am I going to invest time getting to know? And I think statistically, like the stat is 9% of relationships start in a bar. So it's like when people say, oh, I'm going out, I'm going to meet somebody, like probably not someone who's going to be a long-term relationship for you, like statistically speaking. So you have to think about, we get people, oh, I'm going out, like I'm not meeting anybody. Well,
but everyone thinks the data doesn't apply to them.
Exactly. Like I'll be the exception, but going out isn't an intentional way to date. Like you going to a restaurant with your friends, that's not really like intentional dating.
Okay. So the big idea is to create spaces for intentional dating in the church, to not put the pressure on the dating and call it for what it is and not make it weird.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And going about the process, just being, I will also add like really clear where your boundaries are, because I think that's also a conversation, we hear in junior high, the whole like, okay, don't be a temptation. And like, that's really where we get the talk about like physical boundaries in dating. But I think it varies a lot. So something that a lot of Christian people will say is like, oh, I dated someone that's a Christian, and then they're expecting, whatever, the first few dates, like that physical aspect. And I don't feel comfortable with that. So it's like being comfortable expressing like your boundaries. Hey, like I'm a Christian. This is what that means for me and relationships, so that you're not kind of put in awkward positions, or you're not feeling like your boundaries are getting
that's being intentional again. This is what I am. You have to respect this. If not, we should move on.
We're not a fit. Yeah, exactly.
And I've heard that story happen many times too.
Yeah,
and it's different if you're an Amish Christian versus a super secular Christian. Yeah.
And people get scared sometimes, like sharing that. But I think like the right person for you, like, is going to respect wherever you're at. If that's like, hey, I don't actually kiss until whatever, or hey, like, this is where, because there's a lot of gray area, I think, before what we will say is like, sex is off limits, but there's a lot in there that people don't feel comfortable with even before, getting married or engaged or whatever.
That's a great point. So intentionality, creating a culture where it encourages Christian dating, being okay with online dating, and then like going after it, working on yourself with the soul care stuff, and then going after it with the strategy.
Exactly.
Doing all these things could help the church flourish and have healthy relationships, because like I love the Armenian and the Eastern churches that there's the crowning of two people, and it's a symbol of you're going to be creating a mini kingdom within the kingdom of God. Like what we're talking about leads to families being formed and witness to something greater of a bigger family of love.
Yeah.
And even if we didn't have that growing up, the beautiful thing is there's this redemptive aspect to all this. Even if you had a relationship, it was miserable, there's forgiveness and grace. Where does the forgiveness and grace piece come into all this? Because at the end of the day, Christianity is a message of grace. And how do you help people if they had a difficult upbringing, or they've been divorced, or they've been widowed? Like what would you say to those clients?
Yeah, I think a lot of it really has to do with understanding like that God can redeem any story. And I think sometimes people feel like, oh, okay, I messed up. Like, I sinned, or I got divorced, or whatever the story is there. And so they'll either just kind of like shove that all away and not focus on that. But I think especially knowing God and like having that relationship, it's so like our fundamental, like, foundation of the faith is around relationships. So like God cares about your relationships and he wants you to have those like fulfilling and loving relationships. So it's worth doing that work to kind of come to a place of healing, understand, what went wrong, and then seek that, redemptive story if that's like what God has for you. So I think kind of being able to be accountable and have safe spaces where you can talk through and process a lot of things. A lot of people don't like to talk about this in church cultures, and then are, in behind closed doors have struggle with sinning in these areas or addictions to pornography or all sorts of things going on. So I think as a church, it's really important to create those safe spaces and conversations where people can talk about, have accountability and say like, yeah, this is actually like something I need help with, rather than it being like, oh, okay, like, here's the formula, like go go on and do that, where like the world's talking about this all the time.
Right.
Like there's constantly, you can't open your phone without seeing something about dating, relationships, sex, whatever. And so by us like kind of piecing out of the conversation, it's not really helping anybody because they think church isn't the place, Christians aren't the place to talk about this with, and then they're getting all their information like from whoever on TikTok. So I think that being part of that conversation and creating safety around like, hey, like it's okay, like is really the key to being able to have that moving forward.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, the story of Scripture is this redemptive arc of God dying to redeem his bride, the church.
Mm-hmm.
And we get to be face to face with God at the end of it all, at a wedding supper of the Lamb. And a good relationship should reflect that, even if there was baggage or damage, because God will come in, heal, redeem, and unite us with him and also with his people here on earth. So I think it's super important to talk about it, because when done well, it points people to God. When done wrong, it points people in the pits.
Mm-hmm.
And not to deify it or demonize this institution, but to date with intention, and ultimately Christian dating, and date with intention for marriage, to build this little kingdom within God's kingdom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I'll just say one more thing. I think when we listen to kind of like what the world says, it kind of puts the relationship or love as like God. It's like, okay, this is like the ideal, like finding your person or like love. But as Christians, it's really like through that like relationship or love, that's where we experience God's love, like through that. So it's not really the end goal. It's kind of like the means
to the ends. Thank you, Dr. Christie. This is all good catching up and hearing your insights, and keep up the good work on helping people find the right spouse.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for watching this episode of the Christ and Coffee podcast, bringing the church together one coffee hour conversation at a time. Thank you so much for listening to the end of this program. Please like, subscribe, share, comment below. And if there's anything you would like to ask or talk about, please comment below. God bless you. Have a great week and much love.